Hello, this is Ed Runkle, pastor of Tapestry Church, and we welcome you wherever you are in life's journey to join us here for our messages, or join us at 22 Crady Avenue in Millersville, Pennsylvania on Sunday mornings at 10:30. We're a simple church seeking to humbly follow Jesus as best we can, and all are welcome. Welcome to Tapestry Church, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. We're in this series of talks where we're thinking about values that we esteem in our culture, values such as the practice of impartiality and human rights and benevolence and that sort of thing. These values that really have roots in the Jesus story. They're a part of the legacy of Christianity. And we're thinking about how, though we hold these values, at the same time there's something in us that wants to kind of abandon the Jesus and the church that had so much of a role in creating and supporting the legacy. It's kind of like you may remember from last winter how people made a pretty big deal over the Macklemore rap song "Same Love" at the Grammys, a song in support of same-sex marriage. Well, if there ever was a value, or a Christian idea, it's that everyone should be loved with a same love. So it's interesting that, folks, and maybe perhaps even the writers of that song, want to be clear about the fact that they don't want a several thousand-year-old book telling them what love really requires. Well, today we're going to think about what love requires, and we're going to think about compassion and how it's firmly rooted in the Jesus story. And we're going to look at a text from the New Testament book of Luke, who was a gospel writer and kind of like a biographer of Jesus. And we're going to look at the story of the Good Samaritan in chapter 10, beginning at verse 25. And Jesus is telling this story, and behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus replied, "A man," and this is the story, "a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will pay you when I come back.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" And he said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." Well, let me start here. This guy that Jesus is telling this story to is a lawyer, and he knows what's going on. He responds to Jesus with quoting Jesus, saying, this is what the law requires: love God with all you have, heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, "You've answered correctly." Now, if Jesus had stopped there, this would be a very short passage. This guy would have been right, and everybody knows he's right and would have been happy to go home. But Jesus didn't stop there. He says, "You've answered correctly." And then he goes on to say, "Do this and live." Notice he doesn't say, "Answer correctly and you will live," but "Do this and you will live." In other words, it's possible to give the right answer and live the wrong life. That is, the main thing to God is not correct doctrinal affirmation. The main thing to God is that you actually do love. That we love God with all we have and love our neighbors as ourselves and as God defines love. And it's, this guy wants to justify himself, and it's always kind of ugly when someone wants to justify himself. Sometimes when you're being criticized, you want to launch into a defense and kind of explain your actions and motives. We want to justify ourselves, and that's this lawyer. He feels that Jesus' invitation is a kind of criticism of his current lifestyle, and he wants to prove that he's in the right with God. And so he poses the question, well, then who is my neighbor? It's kind of like this. Have you ever posed a theological question because some circumstance or another, has kind of jarred your life? And we pose this question, because we know we're doing something we shouldn't be doing, but we're kind of looking for a theological loophole to justify our behavior or the lack thereof, to kind of to cover that up. Well, that's what this guy's doing. He's thinking to himself, I might come out of this conversation looking bad. I might have to change. I might have to repent, have to feel bad about myself. I can't let that happen. I have to protect myself, justify myself. And so he's looking for a loophole with Jesus. And he says, if the law says I ought to love my neighbor, then Jesus, who's in that category? Who am I obligated to love? It's like if he can just tick that love your neighbor box, if he can just get an easy enough definition of neighbor, then he can believe that he's okay with God. Well, Jesus isn't going to answer, that question, what kind of person am I obligated to love? Because for Jesus, love isn't just an obligation, it's our greatest opportunity. It's why we live. It's what makes us alive. The more you love, the more you live. That's the way it is with God. So instead, Jesus tells this story with three different characters in the potential neighbor, lover, love giver category. And he asked the question, what kind of person must you be in order to be able to love? Which is a whole different question. And so, we hear this word Samaritan in our day, and it's always kind of modified by the adjective good. In our mind, Samaritans are always good folks. We name hospitals and other charitable organizations after them. In our community, we even have a Samaritan counseling center. Samaritans are the ones who devote themselves to helping others. But for Jesus' listeners, and maybe many of you will know this, Jewish people in the first century would have never heard the term Good Samaritan. In fact, if they have heard those two words spoken together, it would probably have made their jaws drop and their skin crawl. In the eyes of Jewish people, that was a complete oxymoron, Good Samaritan. There was no such thing as a Good Samaritan. Samaritans were to be avoided. Samaritans were to be shunned. You didn't let your kids hang out with the Samaritan kids. You didn't go to the places the Samaritans were hanging out. The last person you would ever expect to be honored as a hero by a Jewish teacher would be a Samaritan, because everyone knew they were the bad guys. Good and Samaritan didn't go together. Now, what is Jesus says it was a Samaritan who was good and who saw this man and had compassion. Now, what exactly does he had compassion mean? Well, for one thing, it means he actually saw this guy. One of the things the New Testament gospel writers say about Jesus, his biographers, one of the things they say about him is that he saw people. Jesus saw the crowds. Jesus didn't turn a blind eye to those who were hurting, didn't pretend they weren't there. He didn't isolate himself from the realities of the world. He made himself aware of people's needs by giving them his attention. His biographer Matthew puts it like this: when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. I heard something recently about Oprah Winfrey that has struck me, that there are three things Oprah believes about all people. One, people want to know whether you see them. Two, people want to know whether you hear them. And three, people want to know whether if what they say matters to you. And that's, actually some pretty good stuff. Is there anybody here, who's made it this far in life who doesn't want to know whether people see you or whether they hear you or what you have to say matters? We all wonder whether we matter or not. And, Oprah's empathetic kind of understanding of these desires to be seen and to be heard and to matter, and her affirmation of people on, all three of those levels, it goes a long way in explaining her tremendous success. She's made a killing, listening to other people and seeing them and hearing them and letting them know that what they have to say matters. Well, this Samaritan saw this guy, that he was beaten up and stripped and robbed and left for dead. And, and in addition to that, he had certain thoughts going through his mind, certain questions that had to be answered. What would it be like to be beaten and stripped and robbed and left for dead? How awful would that feel? What will happen to this guy if he's left alone? Who will help him? Could I do something? Could I change this? What else do I have to do today that could be more important than this? And this is really important, really vital. How did the priest and the Levite answer those questions? They didn't. If those thoughts occurred to them at all, they had other thoughts that, I wonder if those robbers are still around. Or, the Romans really should post some soldiers here to keep this road safe. What the heck are all our taxes dollars going for anyway? Somebody ought to do something. When I get to the temple, I think I'll, send up a prayer for this guy. Boy, will God be pleased with that. That it was kind of like they didn't have compassion. Sometimes we think the opposite of love is hatred, but the opposite of love isn't hatred. It's inaction. The opposite of love is when you fail to meet someone's need when you know you can. That's the difference between the Samaritan and the priest and the Levite. The problem with the priest and the Levite is not that they were in too big of a hurry, not that they had, more pressing concerns. Their problem was that they didn't have compassion. They weren't people of compassion. Now, this isn't to say that we, shouldn't have boundaries, that Jesus had boundaries. He didn't meet every need. He took time to be away. There are times when we, need to get away and recharge, and so, we can't always be meeting people's needs. But we have to be able to, if we're going to show compassion, a kind of diagnostic is to ask ourselves questions like, can we be interrupted? How do we respond to interruptions? Can we be inconvenienced? How do we respond to inconvenience? The other day I was out running and I saw this young woman chasing a chihuahua down the street, and she and the dog were coming right at me, and she yells out, "Would you grab him for me?" And my first thought was, yeah, right, and what, lose my finger or something? I'm not fearful of dogs, but a yapping chihuahua headed right at me. It was like, yeah, I'm not so sure. And my second thought was, do I look like Cesar Millan? No. That guy has a good, nice head of hair, and here I am and bald. And see, I'm in the middle of a run here. I use this time when I'm running to think about my upcoming sermons, and I'm right in the middle of thinking through a story Jesus once told about religious leaders who were too busy to help a guy on the street who was in need. And when I thought about that, it was like, that I was going to be writing this message, it kind of hit me. Kind of like the guy in that V8 commercial who's working out with the trainer, and she asks, does he run in the morning? Yeah. Is he getting his vegetables when he can? And she bonks him in the head. It's like God, bonking me in the head. And so I stopped, and I tried to help this woman corral. The little dog's name was Leo, but Leo wouldn't be corralled. There was no grabbing Leo. Leo was completely out of his mind. The woman, I assumed to be Leo's owner, had no influence over him whatsoever. Made me appreciate my own dog all the more. Leo kept running the streets through traffic. I probably spent 10 or 15 minutes trying to help this woman get Leo headed back in the direction of his home. But here's what I'm trying to get at. Even religion can get in the way of obeying Jesus. Christianity, the church, the spiritual information, and all the scaffolding apparatus can get in the way of our actually obeying Jesus. And that's kind of a sobering thing, at least for me. Part of becoming like the Samaritan is choosing not to be so preoccupied with our own agenda that we miss the need in front of us. We open our eyes, we see our neighbors all around us, and even more, empathetically identify with them, and we act on their behalf to meet their need, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's an interruption, even when it costs. Samaritan-like compassion isn't something we can plan. You know what I mean? The generosity that stemmed from the broken heart of this Samaritan, it didn't originate in the moment of the need. It merely surfaced when the opportunity arose. Now I'm realizing that I can't love my neighbor with such mercy-driven generosity when the opportunity is before me without having a heart that's been, kind of liberated from the self-justification that it tends toward and just bubbling with compassion out of brokenness for others. The Good Samaritan didn't plan to do a good deed that day. It wasn't something that he had learned or something that he had trained for. It wasn't something that he could possibly have prepared himself for. The Samaritan was traveling down the road, minding his own business, when a situation arose before him. He was given a spur-of-the-moment decision to make, and he chose to help the man. Showing compassion doesn't have to do with what you plan out. It's great, when you can think about something you want to do for someone in need and make a plan, but often it's when the situation arises and it's a spur of the moment and we have to decide to do the right thing or not. Not long ago, there was a shooting at Seattle Pacific University, and it was stopped because of a guy named John Meese, a 26-year-old electrical engineering student, pepper sprayed the gunman, and as he went to reload his gun after shooting 3 students, he pepper sprayed him, and I think got him kind of in a chokehold. And it was just a situation that arose at a spur of the moment thing. That same week, I think there was a sheriff's deputy in the Georgia, some kind of Georgia courthouse shooting who did the same thing. These are very dramatic life and death examples, but they demonstrate compassion. Where someone makes what maybe isn't the smartest decision or the safest decision, but it's the right decision. And that's what the Samaritan does. He has compassion. See, part of what the gospel of Jesus means is that we don't have to worry about what will happen to us because, God is on that job. And, we don't have to worry about that, so we can love our neighbor. But we're kind of like, Goldilocks from the children's story. Many of us find things too big or too small or too hot or too cold or too firm or too soft. We tend to look, for just the right circumstances to demonstrate compassion when most of the time, opportunities don't roll out, some kind of risk-free red carpet to make some grand entrance onto compassion's stage. And when you think about it, there's no great honor in being Goldilocks. She broke into the home of an innocent bear family. She then committed larceny by stealing their food and, vandalism by damaging their furniture, and what can only be described as creepy, she slept in everybody's bed. Goldilocks is many things, but not really a role model. Jesus, he talked about how a good tree will produce good fruit. That is, if my thoughts, they just kind of automatically flow inside of me. And if that is being redeemed by God, inevitably it will result in all kinds of acts of compassion. If the thoughts that run inside me are self-preoccupied and selfish and all about me, my own agenda and my own ambitions, then that will inevitably be reflected by what I do. And so how does that, flow of consciousness inside me get redeemed? Where does this capacity for compassion come from? This isn't something that we can do without Jesus. It's something that compassion, the source, comes from Jesus. It comes from blessing. I mean, maybe you guys have noticed how blessing gets used so much this day. As one linguist puts it, blessed is used now where in the past we might have said lucky. But in our day, you know, blessed has become sort of a go-to term, you know, and sometimes even to boast, you know, while we're pretending to be humble, you know, kind of fishing for compliments. Blessed has become even a punchline. I read about a comedian from Pittsburgh who recently tweeted, "Caught a piece of bacon falling out of my sandwich right before it hit the ground," which was followed naturally by the punchline, #blessed. Well, here's what I'm trying to say. Our capacity for compassion is directly linked to the fact that we're truly blessed. I mean, Jesus comes to the end of his story and he says, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Who was compassionate? The priest, you know, which we'd expect, the Levite, which we'd expect, or the Samaritan of all people? And the expert in the law replies, the one who showed him mercy. And it's just so rich. I mean, you can almost hear how grudging his answer is. Well, I guess it's the one who showed him mercy. I mean, he can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan, can't even utter the word. But you see what's going on? Jesus isn't saying the Samaritan is your neighbor whom you should love, but is saying the Samaritan was actually the one being the neighbor. In other words, his story totally subverts this guy's pride and self-justification. It addresses a temptation that everyone who is religious must face when we think of others as our neighbor. And we frame it in terms of we're the ones who love and serve them. We're the givers, they're the takers. We're always on top, they're always on bottom. We're the ones in control, we do the helping, they have no control. They're dependent on us for their well-being. We define our neighbors as the ones we're responsible to serve. And we kind of like that, don't we? And we like to see ourselves as the givers and the others as the receivers. That makes us feel good. We're the ones who love God, and therefore we're to love our neighbors and serve them. But what if you're the one who needs to be served? And what if you're the needy one? And what if you need a neighbor to help you? And then what if the neighbor who comes to serve you is a Samaritan? I mean, that's not so comfortable, is it? In the end, you know, Jesus is pointing to himself and saying to each one of us, as he did to this lawyer, are you willing to step down from your proud position of thinking that this eternal life project is all up to you? Are you willing to stop thinking that you're the good one and that the others are the bad ones and you have to have all the answers? Are you willing to give up thinking that you have to be the giver and all the time and, you know, it's always your job to serve? Are you willing to admit that you need neighbors to serve you? Can you see yourself as the one in the ditch, beaten, bloodied, disregarded, helpless, desperately in need of healing and restoration? See, part of what's going on here is the priest and Levite, they represent the failure of Israel and the law of the Torah to provide a complete remedy for our need. But then a Savior comes along who extends mercy and grace to us, making great sacrifices so that we can be healed and restored. Despite the fact that we've never done anything to earn his compassion, he gets down in the ditch, binds up our wounds, pays the considerable cost of our care. And surprisingly, this helper, this one who proves himself to be a good neighbor, is like a Samaritan, an outcast, rejected by his own people, treated like an outsider. Because of the great kindness and grace shown to us, because of what Jesus has done to us, like the Good Samaritan, we now actually begin to feel real compassion for others. We can actually begin to go and do likewise. I'm Pastor Ed from Tapestry Church, and we meet at 22 Crady Avenue in Millersville, Pennsylvania, and I invite you to join us on Sundays at 10:30. Thank you.